All right, this is the last part of the VR template quick start guide, and this is going to be the longest and probably most complicated. We're going to be talking about items. Items are complicated because there's lots of different ways for you to interact with them with your hands. Um, so the first thing you should notice is that they don't actually do all that much stuff on the main event graph. I've got some startup junk that just fixes some things depending on some settings that are set elsewhere. You can go look through these. And then literally the only thing I have it doing on tick is gravity. I guess I should have mentioned this before, but I've did my own gravity function because I want to give the option to do other kinds of gravity besides the basic 1D gravity. Of course, that's all I've inputted here, but you can see that there's also like fully 3D gravity where it takes in the mass and the distance into into effect. Whatever. That's what's on the basis here. Okay, so the big thing about items is that they receive messages from hands. So the first sort of message they might receive is a highlight message. So after your hand finds a target, it automatically sends a message that says highlight, and then if your item is set up for it, it will highlight itself so that you, the user, understand that that is what's currently being targeted. And then so in this case, I'm just using these brightly colored capsule collisions as highlighters. So they'll normally be off, and then once your hand targets them, they turn on. You say, "Oh, I'm good. That's what I was trying to do. I was trying to point my hand at that. Now I have confirmation that in fact I am doing that because I can see it being highlighted." Great. All right. Uh, grip. This is really complicated spaghetti. And here's why, is because there's lots of different things you might need to do in your grip. So for example, is this item already being held? Is a specific subcomponent of this item being targeted, or is it the item actual? Or, well, maybe it's a combination of those two things, where if you're not being held, I don't care whether or not you're targeting a subcomponent. It's just pick up the whole thing. But if you are being held, then I want to target that particular subcomponent. Or what if this is a multiplayer game? What if someone else tries to grab it? Should you allow it? Should you allow it to be stolen? Or should you allow it to switch hands? Do you want to switch hands, or do you want to start manipulating an item on that, or manipulating a subcomponent of the item? And so I've kind of gone through and done all of this garbage in such a way that is pretty intuitive. Not that this page is intuitive, but that when you start using hands and items in the game, it should be intuitive. That if you try to pick something up, um, it will probably work. If you try to grab a handle on something you're already holding, you'll probably grab the handle instead of accidentally switching hands. If you want to switch hands, um, I think that'll probably also be intuitive. But you can go through these and you can see the different variables. Anyway, this is what happens when you get the grip message. Either we decide that it's picked up, and we drop it first to clear some variables that were picked up, or that maybe a subcomponent of your item is being manipulated and you're not being picked up, but that component is going to start doing something. Or maybe it's an anchor and you need to tell the pawn, okay, now your movement is based on how your hands move rather than inputs to the thumbstick. Yeah. Trigger links. This one basically just sets this variable activated. So most items aren't even going to do anything when you press the trigger. However, whether you have the item itself or a subcomponent of the item set, you can go over to the other parts of the event graph and tell it what to do on tick if it's activated. So this is just basic logic for setting up this variable to be used for other stuff. And then here are some actions that happen. So earlier we said, you could be picked up or dropped. Well, okay, so once we're picked up, we need to turn off our physics. We need to let the hand know exactly who I am. I need to know where the hand is, blah, blah, blah. It does all this junk. And then same thing for manipulation, where manipulation means you're just using a subcomponent of the item rather than interacting with the item itself. So that's all like in-game logic of the items. So that's not actually very complicated. Where items get complicated is in the build phase. So if you want to make an item, you need to think about these three things, which is some basic customization. So you'll take this function, and so I've recommend like either creating a child class or copying this one out. But in any case, these are the major functions you're going to use when you start creating them. And rather than double clicking that and going in and editing the function, what I'm going to do is copy this function over, and then where is expand? And then I'll just connect this to my begin play. Ooh, boop. And then I'll start setting variables. So okay, where should this hand be set? Like when this thing is picked up and held, how is it oriented in the hand? And I've got this set up so that you can move the this actual ghost hand, so this hand that will never appear in game, but it's the same scale as the player's hand. Move that around so that it looks like it's holding this thing, and then it'll figure out, okay, based on where you've put this hand, whenever I'm picked up, I want to be in a similar location in the player's hand. And this this is so that if it's in the left hand or the right hand, it is flipped correctly or not, so you can decide along which axis to flip it. And then this is how, when I'm gripped, what sort of animation pose the hand should assume. So probably not claw, probably hammer, and then some fairly high grip override. Okay. And then here's some options. Of course, you can always set these down here. Like get rid of all this and set these up. However, I wanted to have a function that you could copy over and expand, and then see like these are the main things you're going to want to change instead of having to like search for them in your variable list. So is the item sticky? So if it's sticky, it means that just because you let go of it, you don't drop it. That is to say, just because you release the grip button doesn't mean that the item gets dropped. It only gets dropped if you press it again. So for example, in a shooter game where you're probably going to be wanting to hold your rifle like all of the time, this way you don't force your player to have to hold down that grip button. He just presses it once, and then he holds the rifle until he presses that grip button again and releases it. Some items you actually don't want to get picked up. Some items you don't want to be interacted with at all. For items that can be attached to other items, how often do you want them to search for items to be attached to? And then should they only be attached when you drop the item, or should they attach as soon as they find the other item? So this is all for the base item. Now let's talk about subcomponents. This starts to get a little bit complicated. So this one you actually don't want to expand, because if you come and look into it, there's a bunch of spaghetti and stuff. So what's nice is that you can do this. I've set this up so that you don't need to do this. You can just plug in the things that you want. So for example, the sort of schema for how subcomponents work in this blueprint is that they have a scene component that is invisible that that the rest of the component is attached to. The reason we do this is so that we can use different rotations and different like movement references separately from the mesh itself. So in this case they have the same rotation, but you might want to rotate the scene in such a way that the X vector points a different direction, but then you might want to also rotate this while keeping that same X vector. So now we have this rotated mesh, but when I move it, it still moves along the vector of the scene component instead, or whatever. If you use if you make the scene component and the mesh component like coincident entirely, then you won't have any issues. Try to make the scene component. I think you want it to line up with the default mesh. In this case, it does. That'll make certain things easier later. But then your mesh, your secondary mesh, you can do whatever you want to it. Okay, so that was a little bit complicated and also not very well explained, but I'll just make a demonstration. So okay, so we have our scene from which we want to do all our movement. We have the mesh itself. We have the highlighter. So earlier I mentioned that if you target it, highlighting thing will come up. Well, you can also have separate highlighters for manipulatable subcomponents. Um, so that's what that is in that case. It's this highlighter. And the ghost hand, this is for helping it figure out how your hand should be attached to it. So this ghost hand I actually have invisible right now. But as you're making your own things, you'll want to say like how do I want this grip? Do I want this maybe gripped from the side? It's more like a joystick, or do I want it gripped from the top? It's more like a shifter. Um, where you put this hand is going to determine where the pawn's hand, when it interacts with this, is actually set up. And so using these ghost hands is just an easy way to get it right on the item side without having to do a lot of guessing and checking. We'll get rid of that. Okay, so these are the four basic things that any subcomponent has to have. And these are two things that they don't need, only if you're going to be attaching things. So male attachment scene means that this is a item that attaches to other items, or you'll add a female attachment scene if it's an item that can have things attached to it. So the difference being, so like this, a male attachment might be like a magazine, whereas a female attachment is like a magazine well on a rifle. Here is the interesting part, is the movement constraints. I've made a custom struct for this. And you can tell it whether it's item space or component space. I think actually right now it only does it in item space. I'll show you later in the logic where you would fix this if you wanted to. But I'm thinking ahead in terms of capabilities, even though it doesn't actually, if you change this, it won't actually work right now. But if you wanted to make the item a button, well, you can start setting up some options for this button. Is it a toggleable button? That is to say, once you press it, does it stay in? Or does it always come back to its original spot? And sticky is like ultra toggle, which means that wherever you press it is where it's going to stay. Whereas a toggle means you push it past a point, and then it'll stay at that particular point. Sticky means it just stays wherever you put it. This is how far back it'll go, how far up it'll go. This is where the reset point is. This is where the toggle reset point is. See, you wouldn't have that if it was sticky. It would just stay wherever it was. But if you press a toggleable button in and it's activated, it'll reset to the toggle activation. How far back it needs to be pressed before it's toggled. Once it is toggled, how far back it needs to be pressed until it's toggled off. And this is the strength of the spring that resets the trigger. Okay, so you can also, even if it's not a button, you can decide how the subcomponent will move when it's being manipulated. You can constrain its movement. So if it was completely unconstrained movement, it would be just like picking up any other object. It would move along with your hand. But if you wanted to constrain the movement along a certain axis, so for example, I'm going to use the example of a rifle charging handle again, it only moves forward and back. So depending on which axis that is, we'll say it's the x-axis, we'll tell it, okay, stay within these bounds. Maybe it's 10 and 50. And then reset on drop means once it's released, it goes back to its default value. You'll figure out these values are about the scene component. So if we look here, we can see that the scene component is at 0, 0, 25, and then maybe it goes forward to 75, 0, 25, and this is where you'll set that. You can also say, hey, just stay where you are, stay at a certain point that I will specify later, or completely unbounded. Go anywhere you want on the x-axis. And then you do this per axis. Same exact thing for angular constraints. If you want to rotate the thing, um, you pick the different axes, you match up which axis on the hand it's bound to, because depending on, again, the way the hand is oriented to the thing, that it's going to be different relative to this item. So for this item, its yaw is here, and in fact that's the same for this. But if I had the item like this, or if I had the hand set up like this, then the yaw for this mesh would actually be related to the what is this, roll for this hand. So if that didn't make sense, the thing to do is if your rotation is doing something funky, mess with this. And same thing with the min-max values, unbounded, whatever. There's also radial. Radial is um, like angular, except instead of rotating about itself, it rotates about some other point. So if you want radial rotation, you need to give it a different origin. So like, what is the point that it's rotating about? This is just another scene component. And then I actually forget what this pointer is for. It uh, is probably for something useful. You know what? Let's go find out what that pointer is for. So within the template, we have the item, and then I've got a separate kind of blueprint for subcomponent logic, and I call this MANSC logic, which stands for manipulatable subcomponent logic. So let's open you up. Okay, I already have you up on the other screen. And here you are. I want to find out what in the heck does that pointer do? So I'm gonna roll through here real quick. Do polar origin. Does it actually currently do nothing? That's kind of funny. All right, I guess I had some thoughts for what that would do, and then I didn't use it. So that I'm glad I didn't say that this did something specific, because I would have been wrong. It currently doesn't do anything. All right, moving along. These are the grip overrides specific to the subcomponent. These are some various options. Is it a grabbable? Is it a button? If you tell it it's a button, you might want to press that here also. Is it an anchor? Can the pawn move itself by grabbing this and moving? Is it a seat? Can you sit down in it? Can it be manipulated without the base item being held? And so this defaults to off, and so using the example of a rifle and a charging handle again, if this was off, you would not be able to grab the charging handle of a rifle without first holding the rifle. And the benefit of having this off is that if you point your hand at a rifle on the floor and you try to pick it up, this will ensure that the rifle gets picked up and not that your hand gets attached to the charging handle. And then once you are actually holding the rifle and you put your hand on the charging handle, that's when it'll decide that it's time to manipulate that charging handle. Okay, so stay active or reset position. This just has to do with, if it gets dropped, should, number one, if it's been activated, should it stay activated? And then number two, should it go back to its default movement thingies, or should it keep wherever it was last at? You can do that separately. And then for the attachments, these were where you specify the male or female scene components where the attachments happen. But here's where you, I guess I have this in here twice. That's bad, and I'll fix that. Where does it actually take it from? Let's take a look. So go options, attachment settings. Okay, so within these little structs, it actually is not taking it. It takes it from here, the main one, So don't worry about specifying the scene here because this doesn't actually go anywhere. But you want to tell it, okay, is it male attachable? What sort of, for the female things it's going to attach to, what sort of tags will those meshes have? And then you'll have to add those meshes, add tags to those meshes where you want it to be attached to. So for example, or what do we do? Make array. Yeah. So if I'm making a magazine, the target will want to be a magwell, and then whenever I also make the subcomponent for that magwell in a different item, I will add this tag to the mesh itself down here. Okay. Preview means should it take actions if it realizes that it's in vicinity of its female that it's looking for, but it hasn't been dropped yet. Should it show you a preview that it can be attached there, or should it do nothing? And this is just this is a variable for game time that maybe should be hidden somewhere else, but this is just for whether or not it's currently attached to something. And then tags, again, do that make array. If this maybe this one is a mag and it's looking for a magwell. And this will just add this tag to this mesh. Okay, so what this actually goes and does is it takes the different scene components that you told it about, and it takes the various options. And there's sometimes it adds tags for you, but there's two main things that it does. One is that it spawns that Manasy logic actor, which might not be the best way to actually contain the logic for subcomponents. It would be ideal to contain the logic for the subcomponents within the item itself, but I found that this was an easier way conceptually to separate out the various subcomponent logics from each other, even if it's not the most performant. So having extra actors is not good for your scene, but it's conceptually simple. And so it spawns it with, it takes the options that you set and tells it about it. And the other thing is that it makes a struct, and this is what stays on your, this does stay in the base item itself. It has a little list of what subcomponents it has, and it links them to the logic actor that you spawned, so that you can always look up, hey, what I want to find the logic for this mesh. You can always look up this map, look in this map by inputting this mesh, and it'll tell you, okay, here's the logic actor. All right. I'm gonna go talk about the logic actor, but first I want to just point out that you can dynamically spawn these 4 subcomponents. If you don't already have them in a thing or you want them to spawn at game time, you can make that happen here just by telling it what you want them to be and where you want them to be relative to the item. And then you can add in all the same options, and it'll apply those options to those dynamically spawned subcomponents. I don't actually have any options or any examples of this being used in my demo right now. I thought at one point this is how I would like to do menu buttons, and then I decided that's not how I want to do menu buttons. But just so you know, there's a simple way to dynamically spawn and imbue with logic subcomponents for any given item. Okay, so you either made these beforehand, or you've figured out how they're going to be spawned at game time. You've given them constraints for their movement and set up their options for them. Okay, so now what? So now each subcomponent has its little logic thing, logic actor, that will figure out for it how it should move and what other actions it should do. So on start, attach self to item. This is just moving a scene component to the actual component that is being moved around, and I use that as a reference somewhere. It's not important. Okay, on tick, what happens? Well, if we're moving, remember we set up all those movement constraints. This figures out the linear movement per axis. This figures out the angular, and this figures out the radial movement per axis. And apparently I have something wrong with the hand rotation when you move things radially that you can have fun figuring out. Yeah, and so what this does is it goes into the it looks at the item and it looks at the constraints that you've given it, and based on how you've moved your manipulating hand, whichever hand is currently manipulating that subcomponent, it looks at its movement and it takes out the relevant axes, depending on which ones you've allowed to be open, and then it figures out, okay, so we'll only move along the x-axis or whatever. Anyway, this is where stuff moves. Great. This hand distance check, if your hand moves too far away, so not your hand, because your hand is literally attached to the thing, but if your motion controller moves too far away from where your hand is attached, it'll automatically disconnect. And this rotates the hand. I had some issue with this. I don't think it works perfectly in every under all circumstances, and so what I've done in the meantime is just when hands get attached to subcomponents is their rotation is just free. So that causes its own problems, but it causes problems in a predictable way, whereas before they were a little bit complicated. Okay, so if you're a button, you get moved, but you get moved a different way because you get moved by the pointer finger sending a message to you rather than being gripped and then moved around. So if you are a button, it tells you, hey, this is actually where the tip of my finger is, and then it takes that information, and this is where the button decides how it should move, whether or not it's been activated, how to reset, whether or not it's been toggled, etc. You can go through all that funness. Here is where all of the messages come in. Just like for the base item, once you start getting held, or in this case manipulated, we need to set up a bunch of variables both in the hand, on the item, and on the subcomponent itself. Same thing when it stops. We need to make sure we give you your hand back and reset whatever needs to be reset on the subcomponent or item. And this is simply, okay, I'm being targeted, so I'm going to highlight myself. That's actually not that complicated. Really, the complicated part is setting up the item in the first place. And if you just stick to the parts that you actually need, it shouldn't be that bad. There is one special sort of item, and that's a menu. So I'm going to bring one of my menu prototypes over. I encourage you, if you're interested in menus, to number one, just change it off of this one. Just use this one as a example, and don't try to make it from scratch because it's not that much fun. But if you want to change it, you need to know some things about it. So I've split up the buttons into two different parts. One for the actual menu items, and then others for stuff that's internal to the menu. So in this case, here are the items. I don't know why this hand is here. I'm going to make him go away. Go away. Okay. So menu items, stuff that you would want to, that's going to change on the menu. And then there's stuff that doesn't really change on the menu, the back button, the exit button, and then the forward or back for if there's multiple pages. These will change a little bit, but the buttons themselves won't. Moving back to the event graph. And so what this does here is just like we did for the other adding logic to subcomponents here, we're doing the same thing, but there's a special function for adding logic to menu buttons where we have to tell it, okay, this is where my scene is, this is where I am. But we also have to specify further that there's a menu row. They need to be set up as buttons. We can set up how the buttons work here. and then they get added to the map for the internal button logic. And then same thing for the menu items, where they have their own map for the menu items, except these are going to change frequently depending on what the menu is actually displaying. And in this case, I think I got smart and I set up some default settings so that you don't have to change it for each item. You just change it once here. And these are already set up to not be especially stupid. So the buttons figure out when they're pressed, and they do that by having their own. They figure that out as buttons. So that's something that any button can do. If we go back to here, it figures out when it's activated. But the menu buttons have their own special logic. So this is actually a child class of the other logic, the menu items. They do special things when they're activated, like they activate this click message, and they decide what sort of text to display based on what row is currently open. So if we go back here, we can see that we before the game starts tell this menu where to get the table from, and then it loads this table and says, okay, this is the kind of menu that I am. In this case, I'm a test menu. And then it refreshes the rows, and it tells each of the buttons on the row, hey, you take item one, you take item two, whatever. And then these set up their text to reflect that. So whereas this says menu item 0, I think if you go to, once it starts, nope, I think I could show it over here though. Once we hit, yeah, so they're dynamically changing what they say even though they're the same button. And I really wish that giant hand would go away, it's kind of scary. And hiding itself if it doesn't have anything to display for it. And then, so this is, how to make the menu go, and then every time the menu is updated, it tells each button, update your text. There's some actions here, so these ones probably aren't going to change too much. These are the internal button actions, so exit kills the menu, back brings up the previous table, etc. And then these are the items for the actual, these are the actions for the actual menu. And in this case, I haven't set up any. I'm just not that clever, but you can, depending on whatever table you load for the menu, you can then do per whichever row is selected, tell it, hey, do this custom action. And maybe that's opening a new menu, or maybe that's changing a variable in game. Maybe it's doing an action directly. I think that's going to do it for this tutorial. So I want to apologize. The tutorial isn't very good. Hopefully the template itself you find useful. Feel free to please email me or hit me up on Discord. I'll have the links in the description. And then hopefully other people will do more in-depth tutorials and show you how to do better things. One last thing I want to go over is that I very poorly implemented some examples of other items, and I did it trying to use a hierarchy, and I don't know that I did a very good job of that. So starting from the item base, for each subcategory, dummies, menus, or pickups, I then made a child, and then from that child, I made more children. And then as I went on, I found that wasn't actually that helpful. So I encourage you to, if you're making your own items, start here, make a child from this item base, and then use your own hierarchy. Don't use the weird stuff that I've got going on here. But do go into these and see how the logic works, see how I made these things do the things that they do, but then go and apply them to your own items, because it's a messy hierarchy that you don't want to have to deal with. All right. Thank you so much for watching this 35-minute video. Goodness. All right. Good luck.